Hello, I wanted to start this lecture on page 199, aptly titled Liesel's Lecture. And we're going to talk about just a couple of things I want to hit on here so that maybe you can better understand. Let's look at page 199, and it says exactly what kind of people Hans and Rosa Huberman were was not the easiest problem to solve. Kind people, ridiculously ignorant people, people who of questionable sanity. What was easier to divine was their predicament. The situation of Hans and Rosa Huberman, very sticky indeed. In fact, frightfully sticky. When a Jew shows up at your place of residence in the early hours of morning, in the very birthplace of Nazism, you're likely to experience extreme levels of discomfort. Now, I think that is a bit of an understatement, don't you? Um, but why? What is the purpose for the narrator, for the author, to talk about what kind of people Hans and Rosa Huberman are? And his inability to kind of assess who they are. He explores the most likely reasons that people like the Hubermans would accept the kind of responsibility that they are accepting by accepting Max into their home, right? But kind does not seem satisfactory, right? A lot of kind people would not have um, sheltered Max in the way that they did. Ridiculously ignorant implies that they didn't understand the consequences for their actions. But we know as we read Liesel's lecture that they definitely understand the consequences or potential consequences of the actions that they've taken. Questionable insanity or questionable sanity, which assumes that they're insane, that dismisses their humanity altogether, and it makes it seem like that they're doing this only because they're crazy, right? And it dismisses the humanity of the actions that they're actually taking. It makes them less. It makes those actions less significant. So those don't quite seem to be the answer. If we continue to read, it says anxiety, disbelief, paranoia, each plays its part, and each leads to a sneaking suspicion that a less than heavenly consequence awaits. The fear is shiny, ruthless in the eyes. The surprising point to make is that despite this iridescent fear glowing as it did in the dark, they somehow resisted the urge for hysteria. So when death decides to assess their situation and determine their character, he is essentially admitting that it doesn't matter what kind of people they are. The situation is exactly what it is, and their being insane is not going to protect them any more than them being kind will. So, honestly, the reasons or what kind of people they are is not going to shield them from the consequences of their actions, right? Or potential consequences of their actions. You can be the nicest person in the whole world, but if you break the law, you're going to pay a consequence for that eventually, right? You can be the craziest person in the whole world, and if you break the law, you're still going to pay a consequence for that. Um, to varying degrees. But at either way, even here in America, in modern day society, there are consequences for actions no matter what kind of person you are. Death suggests that they do indeed have reservations about helping Max, but he does not condemn them for their misgivings. Instead, he speaks in this sweeping understatement. And what was that understatement exactly? He said, when a Jew shows up at your birthplace of residence in the early hours of morning, in the very birthplace of Nazism, you're likely to experience extreme levels of discomfort. Yeah, that's an extreme understatement. He could have condemned them for not doing what is right, for doing what is right purposes, but that's not what he chooses to do. Instead, he basically puts this in the realm of humanity to me. That's what I get from it. Um, Ultimately, Death seems to conclude that when faced with extraordinary need, even ordinary people who are not kind or stupid or insane are capable of doing extraordinary things. He says the surprising point to make is that despite this fear, they somehow resisted the urge for hysteria. So, this is an example of our theme that courage can transform. Having courage transformed Hans and Rosa Huberman from law-abiding citizens to non-law-abiding citizens, for one thing, but also transformed them in the fact that whether or not they were kind didn't matter, and whether or not they were insane didn't matter. Their actions have transformed them into courageous people. So I think that is important to remember, and I think it's important to remember how this section contributes to that theme of courage can transform. The next thing I wanted to talk about here, we can find on page 208. So let me turn my notes here. Let's see. And I want to talk about uh, Max's character. Okay. If we go to page 208, Max is relocating, or Hans is relocating Max downstairs. It is become apparent that he can't stay upstairs anymore. So downstairs, Hans and Max placed the mattress beneath the steps and built a wall of drop sheets at the side. The sheets were high enough to cover the whole triangular entrance, and if nothing else, they were easily moved if Max was in dire need of extra air. Papa apologized. It's quite pathetic, I realize that. Better than nothing, Max assured him. Better than I deserve. Thank you. With some well-positioned paint cans, Hans actually conceded that it did simply look like a collection of junk, gathered sloppily in the corner out of the way. The one problem was that a person needed only to shift a few cans and remove a drop sheet or two to smell out the Jew. "Let's just hope it's good enough," he said. "It has to be." Max crawled in. Again he said it. "Thank you. Thank you." For Max Vandenberg, those were the two most pitiful words he could possibly say, rivaled only by "I'm sorry." There was a constant urge to speak both expressions, spurred on by the affliction of guilt. This reminds us of our theme, guilt as a burden. Um, Earlier in the novel, we learned that Max was a fighter, right? And he seemed confident, if not arrogant and assertive, and he was unapologetically driven as a fighter. Uh, this was a person who said, "When death captures me, he will feel my fist on his face." That is an arrogant guy, right? When he death may get me, but I'm gonna right in his face first, right? Um, But in the swapping of nightmares, we see a drastically different view of Max. He repeatedly apologizes for putting the Hubermans at risk and for his very existence. When Hans shows him the space under the stairs, Max says it is better than I deserve. He seems to feel unworthy of the most basic human kindness and is exceedingly grateful for even the smallest hint of generosity in human connection. Though he is still determined to survive, this drive causes him immense shame. So we see again this shame, this guilt, um, and how that guilt is a burden to him. There are three major forces that have changed Max significantly in a relatively short period of time. First is the guilt he feels for simply wanting to survive, for depending on others' helps, and putting those people in danger as well. The second change is that he left his own family behind in what he considers an act of desertion. And lastly, the self-loathing attitude Max displays reflects the Nazi brainwashing that taught all Germans to view Jews as inferior, voiceless humans. The Jews were stripped of their jobs, their homes, their families, and their dignity. And we see that in Max. He was stripped of his home, his job, his family, and his dignity as he now pees in a can and lives underneath a stairway. With this constant barrage of disdainful messages, Max has come to believe that he is actually inferior. Another point I want to make, I want us to look at kind of a metaphor here. Uh, I believe it's going to start on, let's see, if we go back to page 205 on the sleeper, it says she could now interpret his signs of life from the movement of his lips, his gathering beard, and the twigs of hair that moved ever so slightly when his head twitched in a dream state. Think about that description, twigs of hair. What does that bring to mind, right? I think of like maybe a dry, leafless fall or winter tree. Um, but when I think of a twig, I think of something that's easily to snap, right? I can snap him like a twig, right? We've heard that before. So I think this is a beginning of an extended metaphor, and I think it's significant. Let's go a little bit further here. On the next page, on page 206, it says, after a few seconds, he managed to scratch his head, the rustle of kindling, and he looked at her. So again, this head scratching reminds her of wood being uh, rubbed together that makes a fire, right? So we can get this image of dry brittleness. Um, Again, on page 209, we see his rustling hair, his cold, slippery fingers. Again, these images of nature are being used as a metaphor for different attributes of Max. And what we see here is what we can infer from this is all of these images that we're seeing that infer to him are all like these cold, brittle, uh, uh, fall or winter type images, right? And if we think of life as seasons, okay, so if we think of life as the springtime is when we're born, right? And then the fall is when we, or the summer is when we start to like really live and life is bright, right? And then the fall comes and we start seeing little gray here. We start seeing signs uh, of things dying, right? Because that's all this is. This is just a sign that eventually I'm not going to be here anymore. These are dead hair follicles. So it's just how nature progresses. And then we see these fall like signs um, uh, also being attributed to Max, who is a young man. Max should be being referred to in symbols that represent spring and summer, but instead he's being referred to in symbols that represent fall and winter. So why is that? Well, um, because he seems like he's near death, maybe. I think that could be it. Or it could just be the way that Liesel is envisioning him because she's still kind of a tad bit scared of him. But when we get over to page 216, we notice something a little bit different. If we go to the very last paragraph on page 216, it says, for the first few weeks in front of the fire, Max remained wordless. Now that he was having a proper bath once a week, Liesel noticed that his hair was no longer a nest of twigs, but rather a collection of feathers flopping about on his head. Still shy of the stranger, she whispered it to his papa. His hair is like feathers. What? The fire had distorted the words. I said, his hair is like feathers. Hans Huberman looked across and nodded his agreement. I'm sure he was wishing to have eyes like the girl. They didn't realize that Max had heard everything. So, the transformation of Max's hair shows that he is regaining a semblance of life as the Huber family cares for him. His hair is no longer a barren nest, barren meaning with no life, a nest with no eggs in it, a nest with no birds in it. Um, he had he is hatched into a feathery bird. It is Liesl's comment about this transformation that will inspire Max to write The Standover Man. So I hope that you got a little bit out of this. So our goals were to talk about courage on page 199, guilt on page 208, and the metaphor of life on page 216. Have a good day.